We're going to continue our sermon series, and just so you know how I told Kotz what to say for Luke's announcement, Kotz told me what to say for this sermon. So this is all Kotz. And, I'll tell you first. Okay, so we're continuing our sermon series where God answers the question, who does God say God is? And that's Exodus 34:6. So we're going to look at that verse. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And so we're on the fourth sermon, third character trait. We talked about compassionate, gracious, and today is slow to anger. I know. You totally set me up. Thank you, Ricky, because ironically, I'm the one assigned to talk about slow to anger. And as a recovering people pleaser, I have spent my whole life, right, trying to avoid anger. My anger, others' anger, God's anger. But I don't think I'm the only one who's struggles with God's anger. Maybe you're new to the faith and you're like, what? God gets angry? Or maybe you're been in the faith a long time and you've heard people say, the destruction and death of that natural disaster, that was the result of people's sin because God's angry and he's mad at us. Or maybe you're like me, somewhere in between where you're like, okay, this story about God wiping out everybody except for Noah, I'm just going to flip through the pages because it really makes me uncomfortable and I don't know how to feel about that, right? But and also because we struggle, later on, I'm going to ask Bruce to come forward and he's going to share his story about, which is real. It's about the struggle and God's anger, but it's real. It's not tied up in a bow. It gives us a glimpse of what God's slow to anger looks like in the middle of pain and struggle and waiting. And so all of this stuff is going on and, we're all God's anger is a hard topic to talk about. But I was wondering, I wanted to ask you guys this, what if we misunderstood God's anger? What if God's anger is not like what we've experienced? Not the punishing and explosive anger that's driven by ego or fear of being inconvenienced? What if we confuse human anger with God's anger? And how we experience anger in our families, with our friends, our bosses, our coaches, our teams, even on the road when people cut us off, all of that shapes how we experience God's anger. So let me say that again. How we experience anger with one another, it shapes how we experience anger with God. So while my experiences lead me to believe anger is only negative and it's very scary, I'm learning anger can be a force for good. Anger tells us when something that's important to us is being violated. So what does God's anger look like? Kotz suggested we speak about Jesus in the temple. So we're going to look at Mark 11:15 through 18. So on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So try to imagine Jesus is flipping over tables. He's boxing people out and not allowing them to move, and he's freeing the doves. Why does Mark talk about freeing the doves? Why is that important? But it's important because people would make their trek to Jerusalem, and they would take their oxen and their large animals. But the poor, like Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, they were allowed to offer and sacrifice something small, like doves. And so doves were sold in Jerusalem so that the poor could spend what little they had to worship God in the temple, to feel right with God. And so Jesus' anger is alerting him that something important to him is being violated. That this system was meant to care for, the system that The temple system, it was meant to care for the people. It was meant to worship God, but it was being exploited. And so we need to remember that Jesus grew up in the temple system and that he had made the annual trip to Jerusalem to sacrifice for 33 years, and this was going to be the last time that he was here. This event happened 4 days before his death. And so Jesus turning over tables, it wasn't impulsive, it wasn't random, it wasn't egotistical or reckless. He didn't hurt anyone physically, but his anger was rooted in love and justice. Jesus was redefining the temple system. He was transforming a system built on sacrifice, where people felt they had to earn God's love, to a relationship rooted in trust and knowing God's love. But the outward expression of anger, it may look the same, but the root of that anger can be very different. Jesus was angry because of his people. The people that he loves were being exploited and treated unjustly. His anger was rooted, like I said before, in love and justice. But in contrast, the religious leaders were angry because their authority and their wealth and their power were being threatened. Their anger was rooted in ego and fear. And while Jesus' anger is redemptive, the religious leaders' anger led to Jesus' death, which is ultimately redemptive. But they didn't know that. So God's anger is rooted in love and justice, and it leads to redemption. So what does God mean when he says he's slow to anger? Well, in Hebrew, the phrase slow to anger literally means long of nose. In the Hebrew culture, a common way to describe someone who's angry was saying their nose burns hot because it gets red and our face gets hot. So when God describes himself as long of nose, he's talking about his deep patience and his grace. Then the author of Judges, he describes God's patience in the cyclical nature of God's relationship with Israel in Judges 2. So we're going to look at that. And remember, if you guys love violence, how many love violent movies? I don't like it. But if you like it, man, y'all got to read Judges, okay? Because this is the era of Judges begins 40 years after the Israelites were rescued from slavery in Egypt. Moses and Joshua have passed. And God has commanded them, like, Israel, go into the promised land. Go into the promised land and live and worship me. And the other nations, the surrounding nations, they'll see who I am as we live out this covenant relationship together. But the struggle to be faithful to God is real and it's messy. And so there's this one story, and even just in Judges 1, I'm reading this in preparation for the sermon. And so they go in, Israel goes in, the men of Judah, they go in, and they're like, find the king of Canaanite. His name is, I don't even know how to say it, Adonai-Bezek. And they capture him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Whoa. And I'm like, is this really what God wanted? Is this what they were supposed to do? But even the king himself is like, this is just because I cut off the thumbs and the toes, the big toes of 70 other kings. But I'm like, is that really just? Is this really what God wants? It's hard to know when you're in the midst of things, right? It's hard to know. Well, how do we follow God in this midst of, in all of this? And so this is just like a little bit of it. There's so much more violence. So you all just enjoy it. All right. But the book of Judges talks about how it struggles. And then the author of Judges tells the cyclical nature of what happens to Israel in Judges 2. And he talks about how it just gets worse and worse and worse until you get to the end of Judges. It just gets worse. But there's this whole generation that forgot about God. Not days, not months, not years, but a whole generation begins to worship Baal and the other gods. And they become just as morally corrupt as the Canaanites. And so this is when God gets angry and gives Israel what they wanted all along. So let's look at verse 14. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to the other gods and worshipped them. And they quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. But whenever the Lord raises up a judge for them, that's his grace, that's God's grace, He was the judge, and he was with the judge, and he saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. And they refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. And so this happened over and over again. And this is the cyclical nature of God's relationship with his people. He gets angry, not out of cruelty, but because he loves them. And he pours out his grace with the hopes that they'll return to him. But he allows Israel to experience the consequences of their choices. They suffer, and then they cry out to him, and then he rescues them until they forget him again, until the cycle starts all over again, and it gets progressively worse each time. So despite Israel's repeated rebellion and stubbornness, God is patient. Judges is full of disturbing violence, so much so that I find myself who wanted to avoid anger, that I get relieved when God gets angry, because his anger means that he cares. So one of the questions that I always had is like, okay, God, you promised this promised land. So why didn't you, before they started all the wars and everything, why didn't you just kind of swoosh in and drive the Canaanites out so Israel can go in their nice land of milk and honey, and then the world could see what kind of God you are? But my Old Testament professor, John Goldingay, he's my favorite, he used to say, God gets his hands dirty in being involved in the world and its messiness. He likes to get his hands dirty. He explained that if God insisted on peace without entering the mess, he'd either remain distant and aloof and uninvolved, or he'd intervene with sheer supernatural forces bypassing our freedom. But God is not distant, nor does he take control. He's deeply committed to us. He chooses the slow and painful path of working within our brokenness, our stubbornness, our poor decisions, and our destructive systems, because that's what love does. His anger is redemptive, and it takes time. We want him to hurry up, or sometimes we don't want him to hurry up, but it takes time. And he doesn't see us as a problem to fix, like, let's just fix this and move on. He doesn't seek outward compliance, like, quick, just obey me. We are his beloved, and he's willing to actively wait with hope for us to return to him, even when it breaks his heart. And so I gave you kind of this theological picture. Actually, Kutz gave you this theological picture of what God's patience looks like. But as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to ask Bruce to come up and share. And as Bruce comes forward, I wanted to kind of set it up that in stories of addiction, there's no formula. This is not prescriptive. This is descriptive. And this is Bruce's unique ongoing journey. And when we hear stories like Bruce's, it's natural to want to make sense of the pain by assigning roles. Like, okay, this is the hero, and this is the problem. This person is the problem that we need to fix. But in addiction, it rarely works that way. It lives within a system, and everybody within that system needs to do their work. And even when everybody in the system is doing their work, that doesn't guarantee a positive outcome. So Bruce wants you to know that he feels very lucky, right? We talked about this in our life group. He knows most of the stories, a majority of the stories, are not like his. He's not perfect. He wants me to be very clear. Don't think that he's perfect. I mean, we always think that, but, we're trying to bust the bubble. We're busting our bubble. He didn't know what he was doing, and he can't even really say that he was angry, but he agreed. I'm so thankful he agreed to share because he really wants and hopes that his story is helpful. So as I said earlier, our life group, we worked on this together, and I said, okay, how do I intro Bruce? How do I ask the questions? And they helped me, and I kind of feel like a lawyer. I feel like you're on the witness stand, dude. So Bruce, thank you for sharing. Tell us about your family.
Well, I'm been married for 40 years to Kyle. We have 2 sons. They're young men, although they act like young boys sometimes. They're 32 and 34. Grayson is the oldest, and Connor is the second child.
This is where I really feel like a lawyer. Tell us what happened in 2020 at the beginning of COVID.
Okay. Yeah, 2020, the middle of 2020, when COVID was still raging. The context is this. We were in June in the midst of mourning Tim Conway's passing. And that drew me closer to Bill in many ways because he was suffering the loss of a son. And, being a father, I identified with, the things that you go through as a parent. But what I didn't know is that literally 2 weeks later, I would be confronted with my son who was falling into depression, and he was addicted to meth. And we had to, he was living with us. And we said, you can't live here like this anymore. You need to get help. Well, instead of that, he hit the streets. He lived on the streets in Venice for 5 months. And so those 5 months from basically the beginning of July or end of June through almost Thanksgiving, we were dealing with a son who was, during COVID, out in the public, living and sleeping outside every day, every night. Didn't know where he was half the time. But I would see him, and I'd, try to encourage him to get help. We were ready to do that, and I was providing him with food and clothes and things like that, because that's what parents do. But in a way, I was enabling him, but I didn't really know what else to do. I didn't want to abandon him or to make him feel like there was nothing worth coming back to. So, sought a lot of help from you all. There were a lot of prayers. I consulted with a lot of therapists, counselors, friends, and, got a lot of support, but there were really no answers because it ends up, for those of you who've been around addiction, it requires, especially an adult, well, anybody really, but it requires that person to finally say, okay, I'm going to get help. And I didn't know if that day would come. Connor's friends would tell me, just abandon him, tough love. Don't help him. Let him hit rock bottom. But I didn't know what that meant because, he was out on the street with no ID during COVID. I don't know what he was doing, but he could have just died on the street and I would never know what happened to him. He'd be unidentified. So I kept finding him. Every night I'd drive around. But during the day, I'd run into him, and I'd give him stuff. And I always wondered, what am I doing here? Am I just making it easier for him to stay out there? And I talked to Kotz, and I said, Kotz, I'm really angry at God at this point because, if he's all powerful, why doesn't he just fix this? I've done this for 2, 3, 4 months now. Can't he just stop? And Kotz said, which surprised me, he said, it's okay to be angry at God. And so I didn't know what to do with that, really. I thought, well, okay. I was never angry at Connor. I just, because, he was my son, and I thought, well, I have to be here for him. My family has to be here for him when he decides, hopefully, to get better. And then in November of 2020, I told him, because he would call me once in a while, I told him, I said, Connor, I can't keep doing this. I love you, but I can't keep doing this. And so a couple days before Thanksgiving, he called me and said, I'm ready. So that was, a day that not many people will get when they're in that situation. I knew I had a chance then. I knew he had a chance. And, we've had people who've lost their kids. Bill's gone through it. Linda's gone through it. I was preparing myself to go through that. But somehow, your prayers, God's grace, something happened. He said, I want to get help. And then so starting then, that was November of 2020, he went through the rehab and detox, and he went to live in a sober living house in Santa Barbara for a few years, and he still lives there. We just had dinner with him last night. We went up there. He has made a complete turnaround. Bill knows the process of sobriety. It's not easy. It's day by day. And he had dropped out of school a few years ago, but he decided to go back to school, so he went back to Santa Barbara City College. He wanted to study finance and accounting. And a couple weeks ago, he just got into UCSB, and he's going there in the fall. So it's, we're lucky because we had at least, there's no ending, but we had a happy outcome. And I don't know how it happened. Maybe if I had cut him off earlier, he would have come around earlier, but I think it required a process. And it could be that God wanted us to go through this. I think it's made me a better person. I know it's made Connor a better person. I mean, he's made a complete turnaround. But it's day by day. He remains in a program. He sponsors other people. He has a sponsor. He's sticking with it. And but I had a opportunity to get him back. And that's, as traumatic as it was, it's not nearly as difficult as others in this room who didn't have that chance. So what did I learn? I'm more compassionate, I think. I'm more understanding of people when I see them on the street, because that was my son. Literally, I would see him on the street, which was hard to see. But it brought about a lot more understanding of people's difficulties. And I'm grateful to this church and the fellowship that you provided to me and the prayers. When Paul Hirose brought me here, I came for the music. And when I saw Phoebe sing Ever Be, I was hooked. I stayed for the food. And in between, little did I know then that I'd be calling upon you all for support. And you provided it, and I'm grateful to you for doing that. So when we talk about God's slow to anger, I was angry at him. It took me a while, but maybe there was a purpose in it all. So here we are, and that's my story.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing and being so open and vulnerable. And I think, when you were going through it, I think that really stuck out was how you stayed with Connor. You didn't just say, well, forget it. I can't be his dad anymore. It's too painful. But you waited, you stuck with him, you watched him, you would drive out and find him, you take him food and whatever he needed. And you waited with hope. And I know you feel like you didn't, or I think you said on Wednesday you didn't feel like you had an option. But I think that shows a lot of courage. And thank you for showing us what God's slow to anger looks like. Let's pray.